The story behind Scripture, Books of the Bible series. This week, an in-depth look at the Book of Numbers.
Usually when you look at ancient ledgers or census data, there's this expectation of just extreme dryness.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it feels like reading a 3,000-year-old phone book.
Right. You look at a spreadsheet of tribal head counts and you just expect dust. But when you look at the census data in the biblical book of Numbers, you aren't looking at a simple ledger.
No, not at all. It is utilitarian on the surface, but there's so much more there.
Exactly. You are actually looking at a massive, moving, cryptographic puzzle. And what is truly fascinating about the stack of sources we are analyzing today, these ancient commentaries, chronological research papers, and the biblical texts, is that you don't even need to take a theological stance to see it.
Yeah, you really don't.
If you strictly examine the historical, literary, and mathematical claims embedded in the text, it is completely mind-blowing. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, we are going to examine the why behind the text, because instead of just noting where 2 million people pitched their tents in the desert, we're tracing the hidden cosmic architecture.
The blueprints, basically.
Right, the ancient prophetic blueprints that are literally hard-coded into the math and the layout of the camp itself.
Okay, so to decipher that architecture, we first have to understand the timeline, right? And the headspace of the people who actually lived in this mobile city.
That's crucial. Geographically, they are making a massive transition.
Right, they start at Mount Sinai, where they receive this highly structured legal system.
Yeah.
And then they move to a place called Kadesh Barnea.
And Kadesh Barnea is what the sources pinpoint as the absolute psychological pivot of the entire ancient narrative.
Because that's where tragedy strikes.
Exactly. According to the chronological research, the initial exodus out of Egypt occurred in 1446 BC.
So they were right on the border of the Promised Land shortly after that, ready to enter.
They were. But at Kadesh Barnea, they send spies into the land, and those spies come back terrified of these legendary giants, the Anakim.
Right.
Their fear ultimately outweighs their momentum, so they rebel against the leadership. And that single moment sentences them to wander until they finally end up encamped on the plains of Moab.
Which is wild, because the period we call the wilderness wanderings was never intended to be a 4-decade journey, was it?
No, not at all. It lasted roughly 38 years and 9 months, ending right around 1406 BC.
The time discrepancy there is just wild to me. I was thinking about it, and it feels like downloading a massive file on dial-up internet.
That is a great analogy.
Because physically, based on the historical records of ancient travel, it only took about 40 hours to march Israel out of the borders of Egypt.
Right.
But the sources point out it took 40 years to get the Egypt out of Israel.
Yeah. The wilderness wasn't merely a geographic detour or a straightforward punishment. It functioned as an agonizing generational crucible.
A crucible for 2 million people.
Exactly. You have a population whose entire worldview was shaped by systemic slavery, their reliance on the Egyptian socioeconomic system, their slave mentality.
The pagan influences they absorbed.
All of that was deeply ingrained in their psychological hard drive.
So they're essentially being forced to unlearn an entire culture out in the sand.
They had to unlearn their Egyptian dependence and adopt the mindset of a journeying, independent covenant people.
Because a slave relies on a master for food and direction, right?
Yes, whereas a free people have to trust unseen promises. The older generation, entirely reliant on the old ways, literally had to pass away in the desert.
Wow.
A new generation had to be forged in this harsh wilderness classroom before they could develop the fortitude to take the land.
Which makes managing this population even more complex. You have millions of people undergoing a generational identity crisis in a hostile desert.
It requires extreme military-level logistical organization.
Right. And the specific physical structure they adopted back at Sinai is where this cryptographic puzzle really takes shape, isn't it?
It is. At the geometric center of this sprawling temporary city was the Tabernacle, the portable sanctuary.
And the physical movement of that tabernacle completely shaped their developing national identity.
Absolutely. The texts describe a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night resting over it.
So the operational rule was absolute. When the cloud moved, they moved.
Right, and when it stayed, they stayed. Sometimes for a single day, sometimes for a full year.
So they are entirely tethered to the center. But digging into the actual census data, something jumps out.
The draft numbers.
Yeah. The military census counts 601,730 men able to go to war. Yet an entire tribe, The tribe of Levi is completely excluded from the draft.
They get a total pass on military service.
Why? I mean, in a hostile desert environment surrounded by enemies, why exclude an entire tribe?
Because the Levites were given a very different and arguably much more dangerous assignment. They served as a literal and spiritual buffer zone.
A buffer against what?
Well, in the ancient mindset, God's presence dwelling in the tabernacle was considered highly volatile to the uninitiated. The sources describe it almost like a consuming fire.
Oh, I see.
The Levites were stationed in a tight ring immediately surrounding the tabernacle. They acted as a substitute for the firstborn of Israel to protect the rest of the massive camp from divine wrath.
Like control rods in a nuclear reactor.
That is exactly it.
They aren't just standing there holding a perimeter. They are actively absorbing the radiation of that intense divine presence, so the rest of the camp doesn't experience a catastrophic meltdown.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. If anyone unauthorized approached the center, the Levites were tasked with stopping them.
Essentially absorbing the risk to keep the 2 million people on the outside safe.
Exactly. They regulated the incredibly potent force at the core of the community, serving as the interface between the mundane and the holy.
But the placement of the remaining 12 tribes around those control rods, around the Levites, isn't just a matter of crowd control, is it?
No, not at all.
This is where the geometric layout reveals something that completely blew my mind. The exact positioning encodes a deeply symbolic mathematical pattern.
What's fascinating here is the sheer mathematical precision of it all. The 12 tribes, excluding Levi, were divided into 4 camps of 3 tribes each.
Right.
And they were ordered to station themselves strictly at the 4 cardinal compass points around the Levites.
Let's break those down for the listener. On the east side, you had the camp of Judah, whose tribal standard or flag was a lion.
Right.
On the south, the camp of Reuben, symbolized by a man. On the west, the camp of Ephraim, symbolized by an ox.
And on the north, the camp of Dan, whose standard was an eagle.
So lion, man, ox, eagle. But to fully visualize what this looked like, we have to look at the strict rabbinical constraints governing how they pitched their tents, right?
Yes. The texts indicate a tribal camp could only be as wide as the Levite encampment in the center.
So any excess population couldn't just spill out randomly into the corners, say, the southeast or northwest quadrants?
Exactly. They had to extend straight outward in their assigned cardinal direction. So the length of each tribal camp stretching into the desert was strictly proportional to its head count.
Okay, so let's do the math on the census numbers. The east camp, Judah, had 186,400 men.
Massive camp.
The south, Reuben, had 151,450. The west, Ephraim, was the smallest at 188,100. And the north, Dan, had 157,600.
So visualize that.
Right, if you were standing on a high peak in the desert, looking down at this camp of 2 million people constrained to these strict lines, the east arm is massive, the west arm is short, and the north and south arms are almost perfectly equal in length.
The varying populations stretching out into the desert formed a massive, unmistakable shape of a Latin cross.
A literal cross, drawn in the sand by the bodies of 2 million people.
Yes.
Centuries before the Roman Empire existed, let alone a conceptualized crucifixion as a form of execution.
The architectural foresight is staggering. And the symbolic layers don't stop at the geometry either.
What else is there?
Those 4 primary standards flying at the cardinal points, the lion, the man, the ox, and the eagle, they perfectly mirror the 4 faces of the cherubim guarding God's throne in heavenly visions.
The ones described centuries later by prophets like Ezekiel, right, and John in the book of Revelation.
Exactly. The earthly camp was engineered as a fractal mirror of a cosmic throne room.
And the sources trace this even further into the New Testament text, pointing out how these 4 faces correspond directly to the 4 Gospels.
A map perfectly.
Matthew presents the Lion of Judah. Luke focuses on humanity, the Son of Man. Mark portrays the tireless servant, the ox. And John brings the divine heavenly perspective, soaring like the eagle.
And we can push this cosmic connection even deeper into antiquity. This geometry connects directly to the Mazzaroth, the ancient Hebrew zodiac.
Wait, really? The zodiac?
Yeah. Long before stellar constellations were co-opted by pagan astrological traditions, ancient sources argue they charted a continuous redemptive narrative in the stars.
Oh, wow.
The celestial story began with Virgo, the virgin representing the seed, and ended with Leo, the Lion of Judah, representing the conquering king.
So by orienting the tribes with the Lion of Judah at the eastern head, facing the rising sun, the camp of Israel was mapping the heavens down to the earth.
Embedding a cosmic story of redemption right into their daily living arrangement.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
So from a macro perspective, from an aerial view, this camp looks perfectly designed, deeply prophetic, and spiritually sound.
It does.
But the sources highlight that when you zoom in on the northern camp, the tribe of Dan, you uncover an incredibly dark historical underbelly.
Dan is a profound anomaly. To understand the mechanism behind Dan's dark trajectory, we have to revisit the patriarch Jacob's original deathbed prophecy.
Right, what did he say?
Jacob assigned Dan the symbol of a serpent. He specifically prophesied Dan would be a snake by the roadside, biting the horse's heel so its rider falls backward.
But when they're actually setting up the camp in the wilderness, the chief of Dan, a man named Ahiezer, seemingly rejects that.
He decides he doesn't want a snake on his flag.
So he changes their tribal standard to an eagle. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because historically, the eagle became the primary symbol of Israel's greatest, most devastating enemies.
It is a chilling historical echo. I mean, why choose the eagle? The eagle represents a predatory bird of prey, a dominating imperial force.
Look at who later marched under the banner of the eagle.
The Romans, who completely destroyed the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, the Greeks under Antiochus Epiphanes, the Byzantines, and much later, the Germans.
So by adopting the eagle, Dan seemingly aligned its core identity with the adversaries and destroyers of its own people.
And that adversarial identity plays out in these strange historical links the sources unpack.
Like the Spartan connection.
Yes. There is an ancient letter from a king named Arius to the Jewish high priest claiming that the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans of ancient Greece, were actually of Jewish stock.
Potentially linked directly to the tribe of Dan, which is insane.
The implications of that letter are massive. The Spartans were famously known for a ruthless, hyper-militarized, violent culture.
If they share a bloodline with the tribe of Dan, it perfectly mirrors Dan's biblical descent.
Absolutely. Dan famously abandoned their divinely allocated land in Israel because they found it too difficult to conquer.
So they migrated to the far north and violently slaughtered a peaceful, isolated city just to take their land.
They completely circumvent the plan. And it leads to spiritual ruin.
Because the texts highlight that Dan was the very first tribe to introduce formalized institutional idolatry into Israel, right?
Yes. And because of this internal rot, their genealogy is practically erased from ancient records. In the book of First Chronicles, their family lines are conspicuously omitted.
It goes even further than that. In the book of Revelation, chapter 7, when the 144,000 are prophetically sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel,
The tribe of Dan is entirely missing.
completely omitted from the roster.
The sources suggest a direct connection between Dan's serpentine origins, their historical apostasy, and future prophecies regarding a coming world leader.
Often referred to as the Antichrist.
Exactly. The implication in these ancient commentaries is that this final adversary might have historical or genealogical roots tying back to this specific wayward northern tribe.
Wow. Okay, so if the tribe of Dan represents this internal rot, this constant human tendency to look backward, co-opt hostile identities, or turn to idolatry, how did the rest of the camp survive their own daily failures?
Well, that brings us to how they were physically and spiritually sustained in this environment.
Because the sources emphasize that everything they experienced out in the sand functioned as a type, a prophetic shadow of future events.
The wilderness was essentially a massive object lesson classroom. Take the daily manna, for example.
We often think of it as mere survival rations.
But calculate the logistics. To sustain 2 million people, the sources note it required something like 1 million tons of food annually, materializing 6 days a week.
That is not just foraging.
No, it was an overwhelming supernatural provision. It was a literal bread from heaven that directly established the theological framework for the New Testament concept of the bread of life.
But the wildest object lesson in the entire wilderness account has to be the brazen serpent in Numbers chapter 21.
Oh, the serpent.
The Israelites start complaining against the leadership again, and the camp is suddenly plagued by fiery serpents. People are being bitten and dying.
So Moses prays for a solution, and he is instructed to forge a bronze serpent and mount it on a pole.
And the directive was that anyone who looked at the bronze serpent would live. Wait, let me push back on this, because I was reading these sources and trying to wrap my head around the mechanism here.
Okay.
You are being actively hunted and killed by venomous snakes. And the divine solution is to look at a metal statue of the exact thing that is killing you.
It sounds absurd, doesn't it?
The logic of the ancient text is that they take the exact source of their trauma, the snake cast in metal, and display it. It sounds like an ancient form of exposure therapy, but with a theological layer. Why not just make the real snakes disappear?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains the profound typology here. It is profoundly counterintuitive to basic human logic, but it makes perfect sense symbolically.
How so?
The materials used are the key to unlocking the mechanism. In the ancient Levitical system, bronze is the metal explicitly associated with fire and judgment.
Because it is the only metal that can withstand the intense heat of the sacrificial altar.
Exactly. And the serpent, tracing all the way back to the earliest texts in Genesis, represents sin and the curse.
So casting the serpent in bronze means the sin itself is being subjected to judgment.
Yes. When Moses lifted the bronze serpent, he was lifting up a symbol of the very thing that was destroying them, but rendering it completely powerless because it had already endured the symbolic fire of judgment.
And Jesus himself unpacks this bizarre historical event in the Gospel of John, doesn't he?
He does. He states, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up."
He was claiming that he would become the ultimate object of judgment.
Precisely. Just as the Israelites had to gaze upon the judged serpent to be saved from physical venom, humanity would have to look to him, bearing the ultimate judgment of sin, to be saved from spiritual death.
Wow. So what does this massive cryptographic puzzle mean for you, the listener, sitting in traffic or making dinner today?
That's the real question.
Because the book of Numbers is fundamentally about the space between redemption and inheritance. It's a manual for the wilderness. And I think we all find ourselves wandering in our own transitional periods.
We certainly do.
We get our exodus, we leave a bad situation, a toxic mindset, an unhealthy environment. But we quickly find that physically getting out of Egypt is the easy part.
The agonizing part is getting the Egypt out of you.
Yeah.
The wilderness is the space where you are forced to unlearn the coping mechanisms of your past and learn to rely on a completely new reality.
And the Israelites failed so often because they kept romanticizing the past whenever the desert got too difficult.
They preferred the predictable comfort of their old slavery over the terrifying uncertainty of their new freedom.
So what is your wilderness right now? What are the old Egyptian mindsets, the internal mechanisms you are being forced to unlearn in the desert?
As you ponder your own transitional periods, I want to leave you with one final unexplored mystery from the sources that takes this concept of unfinished business to an entirely different level.
Okay.
Throughout this journey, the Israelites were deeply terrified of the Rephaim, these legendary, literal giants whose massive remains and terrifying legacy haunted the landscape.
Kings like Og of Bashan were recorded as the last of these mammoth men, the very giants, the Anakim, that made them panic and turn back at Kadesh Barnea in the first place.
Now, the Israelites eventually fought them, but the sources note something incredibly provocative.
What's that?
The specific geographical areas where Joshua and the Israelites later failed to fully exterminate these giants in their strongholds are the exact modern-day territories of the Golan Heights, Hebron, and the Gaza Strip.
Wow. Wait, really?
Yes. It forces us to ask, how do our ancient failures to conquer our deepest fears, our personal giants, echo thousands of years into the future?
That is heavy.
What happens when we leave a remnant of the things we were supposed to drive out of our lives entirely?
That is something to seriously mull over. A 3,000-year-old spreadsheet revealing a cross drawn in the desert, Spartan history, metal snakes, and giants whose shadows still fall over the modern map.
It's all hidden right there in the numbers.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Until next time, keep questioning the surface, and we'll see you in the next one.
Join us every week for a deep dive into a book of the Bible from the story behind Scripture.
If you'd like to read more about the stories behind Scripture, try Written in Fire, available on Amazon.com. It's the story of the destruction of Solomon's temple, told through the pages of the Bible and the voices of the prophets. The fire that destroyed the city and the temple did not end in ashes, but in a Messiah. Pick up Written in Fire on Amazon.